services are available. You have the choice of either floor, English, or French. A reminder that all comments should be made through the chair. Now, in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informed by our extraordinary clerk that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of our meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 29th, 2024, the committee will now resume its study of Canada's approach to Africa. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, and I'd like to highlight for all the members that these are witnesses that we had scheduled to hear from earlier, but then because of a vote previously, we were unable to hear from them. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I understand it's very late local time for you, so we are doubly grateful that you kindly are connecting with us today. We have from the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, Mr. Benjamin Sultan, who is the Director of Research. From the International Rescue Committee, we are grateful to have Modou Dia, who is the Regional Vice President for West Africa. And finally, from the United Nations World Food Programme, we're grateful to have with us today Ms. Edith Hines, who is the Director of Program, Policy, and Guidance. Each of you will be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions from the members. If you do see me holding this up, that means your 5 minutes are up, and that means you should be essentially, tying things up in less than 15 seconds. So all of that having been explained, we'll start off with Mr. Sultan. You have 5 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Je vais parler en français.
Yes, I'll be speaking in French, which is my mother tongue. I'd like to start by talking about Africa and global warming. It's one of the regions that has contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, which is responsible for climate change. Despite its low contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, Africa is experiencing the effects of climate change with rising temperatures, more frequent droughts and heat waves, particularly in South Africa. The last report from the panel on climate change dedicated an entire chapter to Africa, which showed that there's an average and extreme increase of temperature, more and more intense rainfall, increased drought and disappearing glaciers. And even though this is not as much as in other areas of the world, a lot of this change has to do with human-provoked climate change. And according to the forecasts, there will be an intensification of these changes due to climate change, including more floods, increased drought in South Africa, Northern Africa, for example, tropical cyclones that will become more and more intense, as well as deadly heat waves that will expose populations to, as I said, deadly effects. So all of this seriously jeopardizes the economies of those countries, infrastructure, food security, healthcare, and other infrastructure and ecosystems in Africa. In terms of the economy, climate change will lead to a reduced growth of the economy and widening inequality in terms of income within countries and also between countries. In terms of food systems, climate change has already led to a decline in agricultural productivity, and that is at risk of increasing in the future. We've also observed an adverse effect of climate change on health, the health of millions of Africans due to extreme temperatures, extreme heat, and the spread of infectious diseases. And in cities and infrastructures, there's rapid urbanization, which is increasing exposure to climate risks, particularly heat waves, and flooding on the coastal regions, and that will lead to climate migration, which is a real reality nowadays. A lot of this is happening domestically within countries, from the countryside to the cities, and between neighbouring countries, rather than towards countries that have high incomes for the time being. So it is crucial to put in place adaptation measures in short order, such as gender and equity mainstreaming, early warning systems, the use of local and indigenous knowledge, an early warning system, climate adaptation, agricultural diversification and planning. However, there's a feasibility issue to do with adaptation in Quebec, which is the technological, institutional, cultural and financial obstacles that are holding back those efforts and tied to the security of those countries. Climate change impacts and adaptation strategies may not be sufficient in Africa. And given to the risk of climate change on the continent, there's a dearth of knowledge and even research on adaptation strategies in Africa. This lack of meteorological data makes it difficult to analyze climate trends and ecosystems, and there's not much funding for research. Over the past 2 decades, only a small amount of funding for research on climate change was allocated to Africa. There are initiatives in Canada and France to do with research. For example, in Canada, CLARE, the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Initiative, which is a partnership between Canada and the UK to promote and include the most, or to help protect the most vulnerable nations in Quebec. In France, there's the IRD, which is the Development Research Institute. It's an interdisciplinary institute that's in partnership with the Intertropical and Mediterranean Zone, and has mobilized a number of African countries on the issues of sustainability, and is looking for concrete solutions to real problems. That concludes my opening remarks, and I'd like to thank you for your invitation. I'm more than happy to answer your questions.
Next, we go to Mr. Dia from the International Rescue Committee. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Merci beaucoup pour le.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think I'll try and be brief because I think that we'll have an opportunity to speak in the question and answer period. Mr. Benjamin talked about the climate situation in Africa, but across Africa, there are a number of countries that are dealing not only with climate change, but a political and crisis and an economic crisis which is increasingly difficult. We are proud to testify side by side with other colleagues who are on this panel today to talk about the need for an action-oriented program for those countries that are suffering from humanitarian issues in Quebec. The number of people needing humanitarian aid in the world has quadrupled, and the lives of those people are marked by extreme danger, permanent insecurity, and a very high rate of poverty. The 10 countries that our organisation deems to be at most risk of a new humanitarian emergency, 8 of which are in Africa. And for the second successive time, at the top of that list is an African country, i.e. Sudan. Currently, we've noted that the humanitarian crises are in the most vulnerable countries, pushed by factors including the rise of violent coups, the failure to uphold international humanitarian law, exposure to climate risk, and increase in public debt matched with diminishing international support. And there's also a dearth of international financial support. The severity of conflict in climate-vulnerable contexts across Africa demands clear and decisive action. 30 years ago, 44% of conflicts took place in vulnerable states that are vulnerable to climate change. Now it's 67%. The severity of conflict in climate-vulnerable contexts across Africa demands clear and decisive action, as I said. If the systems and structures set up to eliminate poverty, build resilience, and respond to humanitarian needs are not delivering in the most severe and urgent emergencies, they are not working. A course correction is required. Without this, entire regions are at risk of being left behind, and yet international humanitarian needs are severely underfunded and are getting worse. Funding gaps between appeal figures and humanitarian commitments rose from $4.6 billion in 2013 to $32.5 billion in 2023. We especially welcome Canada's humanitarian leadership, including the new $350 million commitment in Budget 2024 to meet increasing international humanitarian assistance needs. It's essential the humanitarian system do things differently and innovate to meet the overwhelming needs. This includes investing in interventions and approaches that can deliver the greatest impact for the most people in need with limited budgets. One of the most impactful things we can do to scale our services is to understand and improve the per-unit cost of our programs, which IRC is a leader in. The IRC's experience demonstrates that with the right approaches, we can change the lives of communities, even in the most complex crises. The following are our 6 first-order priorities for action. 1. To save lives in fragile and conflict-affected states by investing in climate adaptation, resilience, and anticipatory action. A lot of the funding focuses on climate change mitigation, but Africa is already coming to grips with the consequences of climate change. So it's urgent and important to invest in climate change adaptation. Second, tackle extreme poverty and economic drivers of rising humanitarian needs. We need an increased investment in social safety nets and also financial cash assistance. We also need to prioritise gender equality in crisis responses and shift power and resources to women-led organisations. That's a very important recommendation. We know that in most countries that are in crisis, women suffer the most. The fourth recommendation is to promote shared prosperity by increasing aid and tackling the debt crisis. And the fifth recommendation is about supporting and protecting forcibly displaced people. And finally, the sixth recommendation is to stem impunity and reinforce international humanitarian law. As far as the sixth recommendation is concerned, I'd like to hone in on the fact that the solutions outlined above are necessary, but alone they are insufficient if steps are not taken to reduce the impacts of conflict on civilians. Violations have become normalized. There's attacks on hospitals, schools, and homes. There's a denial of access to critical life-saving aid and mass killing with impunity. Without accountability, these trends will continue. Faith in the international system needs to be restored. The weaponization and denial of humanitarian access must be given increased diplomatic attention alongside other violations of international law. So I'll stop there, and I'd be more than happy to respond to your questions, should you have any. Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Diao.
We go to Ms. Hines, who is from the United Nations World Food Program. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you this afternoon to speak about Africa and the role of the World Food Programme that we play in addressing extensive food insecurity, which continues to impact the continent. WFP is the largest humanitarian organization, and we work across many of the world's most fragile settings to save lives during emergencies and to contribute to building sustainable solutions to food insecurity that can help to change the lives of the people we serve over the long term. Unfortunately, hunger is on the rise in Africa. where already more than half of the world's food insecure people live. This increase in hunger is largely driven by three things: conflict, weather extremes, and economic shocks. We have a large footprint in Africa, which means we witness firsthand the challenges that African countries face, especially when it comes to hunger and malnutrition. Africa is home to more food crises than anywhere else in the world. 3 out of 4 WFP's corporate level emergencies in 2023 were in Africa. Sudan and Sudan's neighbors, Chad, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Sudan, the ongoing conflict has disseminated the country's ability to feed itself. More than 1/3 of the country, or 18 million people, are now acutely food insecure. We know that this will worsen this month as Sudan's lean season begins, and WFP continue to face substantial challenges in gaining cross-border access needed to reach the most affected by the conflict. This conflict has also impacted neighboring Chad, which now hosts more than 1 million Sudanese refugees, making it home to one of the largest and fastest growing refugee populations in Africa and the world. We assist on average 500,000 people per month with emergency food rations in Chad alone, in some of the harshest and most remote regions. We are racing against the time to pre-position food in the hardest to reach areas before the rainy season cuts off our road access in June. This is why we need predictable funding so that we can purchase supplies early, get food staples to rural and remote locations that do not have local food supply routes. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the third major crisis we are responding to right now on the continent. About 1/4 of the population, or 23.5 million people, are facing emergency levels of hunger. Due to escalating conflict in the eastern part of the country, 6 million people have had to leave their homes and livelihoods. The situation is particularly catastrophic for women and girls, especially those living in camps for displaced people. They face a constant threat of sexual violence during their daily activities. When we place food assistance decisions in the hand of women and facilitate a safe environment for income opportunities, they're less likely to be exposed to such risks. As well as conflict, we can also see increasing damage caused by climatic shocks throughout the African continent, which are disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable countries. The southern region is currently experiencing the most severe El Niño impact since the 80s, resulting in drought and crop failures. And the governments of Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi have all officially declared national states of emergencies. We are working with these governments to provide cash transfers to the most vulnerable, to facilitate international food procurement, and providing logistic support. But also in anticipation of El Niño, we launched early warning and anticipatory action programs to ensure that people receive cash and other support before the climate shock hits. So WFP reached over 230,000 people in Southern Africa with $14 million in anticipatory cash and support. And this anticipatory support helps individuals to prepare and thus increase their resilience in time of crisis. Additionally, many countries continue to face chronic seasonal food security challenges. In West Africa and the Sahel, the May to August lean season has begun. Due to persistently high food prices and market instability, we predict that there will be about 55 million people who will struggle to feed themselves. Mr. Chair, during my own 25 years with WFP, I have seen firsthand how food crises have become more complex, more severe, and more protracted. Despite the rising needs across Africa and the world, shrinking resources and funding cuts have forced WFP to drastically reduce assistance in almost every country we work. In Somalia, for example, we had to reduce the number of people we serve by half. But we will continue to work in the front line of hunger and prioritize the most vulnerable by addressing their nutritional needs. In a world of rising needs and limited funds, it's critical that we simultaneously work to change lives while also saving lives, working across the humanitarian development peace nexus.
Ms. Hines, I'm afraid you're considerably over your time, so we're going to have to proceed with the questions, but I hope you can cover what remained in your responses to the members. First, we start off with Mr. Abel-Taif. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for the witnesses. I've got 3 minutes. Ms. Hines, I have a question for you. Everything is on the rise. The cost of living, the cost of food, the conflicts, everything almost in a big part of Africa is on the rise. How is Canada doing as far as approaching these conflicts and the food insecurity situation? If you can give us a quick brief on that, because I have following questions to that. If you can.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, if Mr. Abel-Taif could repeat, how is Canada doing, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Was that the question?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to Mr. Abel-Taif?
Of course.
Yeah. Canada has been a very steady donor to the World Food Programme, and this is both on the two sides that we support, and that is within our mandate, and that is addressing humanitarian needs, but also more working towards the longer-term solutions. So we know that we have to, while addressing the needs that are very high, we also have to work on reducing the humanitarian needs. And Canada has been helping in that mandate as well. They can additionally help us also I mentioned that humanitarian access is becoming more and more difficult. Conflicts are becoming more and more complex. And so this is where Canada and our other members can help on the political and diplomatic support to influence national partners and national governments and actors in conflict to ensure that we have humanitarian access and the humanitarian space to actually work and provide the assistance that we need to do. So humanitarian diplomacy is a very important part.
In case of Sudan in specific, it's a very devastating situation. Can we count on the neighbors, and where Canada can be most effective regarding the neighbors of Sudan to be able to get access to areas where food and everything is needed?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may respond to the question. For Sudan specifically, there's a lot of movement of Sudanese that become refugees and moving into other countries. Chad, I mentioned as a big one where we have a big influx. We still have a lot of issues with negotiating cross-border movement, so we can actually move our resources and our support to those refugees. While we do have support from neighboring countries as well, because we set up kind of a regional, and this is not just WFP, this is the whole humanitarian community, a regional operation for the Sudan crisis. So we're working both from the Chad side as well as from the Sudan side, but there are different parties in a conflict.
I'm afraid, again, we're out of time. Thank you for your response. Next, we go to Ms. Vandenbelt. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to direct my first question to Ms. Hines. And I just wonder if I believe that Canada right now is the 4th largest global donor to the World Food Programme globally, if you could confirm that. But more particularly, if you could comment, our framework, of course, is around the FAAE, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which guides everything that we do in development. And you specifically mentioned the impact of food insecurity and conflict on women and girls. So I wonder if you could comment on how Canada's contributions are helping, but also particularly how that feminist framework is making a difference.
Yeah, and for us, Mr. Chair, if I may respond, please. For us, gender inclusion, gender and protection are cross-cutting across all the work we do. But specifically in conflict, we look at how does conflict affect women differently, and we see that very often they have a higher vulnerability. So we have been including in our humanitarian access kind of analysis, specifically looking with a gender lens, saying like how are women differently and very often more impacted by limited access. So we have actually analysts, conflict analysts in each of our regions to make sure that we have very context-specific analysis that goes into the planning of the operations. So on conflict analysis specifically, but also just different protection in general about how we provide our assistance. We take women's issues and women vulnerability into account. We also do that for other vulnerable groups, which might be, depending on the context, indigenous groups or people with disabilities. So, but the women's groups, women's girls are extremely vulnerable, and we do take that into account in our programming and planning. Very much in line with Canada.
Thank you so much. I do want to direct a quick question to Mr. Dia, specifically around climate resilience, and you mentioned the link between the political and economic crises and the climate crisis. I wonder if in 30 seconds you could perhaps elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, quickly to say that, most of African countries have been suffering from climate vulnerability for years. We do know that, now the conflict, if I just take a quick concrete example of Mali, we did some survey in some part of northern Mali, and we found that 67% of community level conflict are due to conflict like land or resource control. So what we are seeing is that, these countries have been suffering from climate change, but with now the conflict, the situation has been exacerbated, and the population who has been already very vulnerable because of climate vulnerability are now suffering from conflict in addition to that, etc. So this is actually putting more and more people to extreme poverty and extreme vulnerability. I can say in 30 seconds, but I would have developed more, but yeah.
Thank you. Very grateful. We next go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our witnesses, particularly given the late hour for many of you, some of you. We know that many Western countries have slowly withdrawn from Africa over recent decades, and the upshot of that has been that other nations have swallowed them up and filled that void. China, Russia have filled that void with the ramifications that we're all fully aware of. Canada is among those countries that wants to fill the void. We're trying to convince parliamentarians that Africa is a land of opportunity, that we require massive reinvestment. But you've painted a somber picture of the state of affairs in Africa. For example, a drop in economic growth, an increase in the number of crises resulting primarily from climate change, political crises, the displacement of people, food crises. So it's a bit of an open-ended question that I'd like to ask, and I'll direct it first at Mr. Sultan and then Mr. Dior, and finally Ms. Haynes, in that order, if I may. So, how can we go about convincing the government in the face of such a sombre state of affairs as you've portrayed it? Response: thank you very much for your question. I think that there are two aspects to that question. First, well, we have a moral duty to help Africa when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, which have increased due to the actions of developed countries such as Canada and France. So we have a moral duty to help those vulnerable countries. They're particularly vulnerable to climate change. That strikes me as one of the most important aspects. Secondly, I think that there are huge opportunities for Africa. The maximum output that can be achieved and the output that is actually achieved, well, there's a major discrepancy there. So we can optimize that. There can be far greater productivity were there to be greater investment in Africa. And I think it's the only place in the world where there's such a discrepancy between the potential maximum output and the current output. So that attests to the fact that this is a land of opportunity, which is significant for Canada, particularly. Mr. Diar, the floor is yours.
We're going to have to go to the next question. It's 3 minutes. So we now go to Ms. McPherson. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today and sharing their testimony with us. I have to take a moment out of the committee time at this point to move a motion that I had brought forward some time ago that is on a very important issue that I think this committee needs to deal with as urgently as possible. It is with regards to the sales of arms goods to Israel. The motion was first given notice of on April 10th. Would the members like me to read the motion, or are they aware of the content of the motion? They're aware? You'd like it? That given the failure of Global Affairs Canada to produce the documents requested by this committee on February 12, 2024, and the letter to the committee from the Deputy Minister dated March 13, 2024, requesting further instruction, the Chair instruct the clerk to publish the letter and annex received from Global Affairs Canada on Canada's arms exports to Israel on the public committee webpage, that the committee instruct Global Affairs Canada to provide the following. 1. Details on all current open export and brokering permits for military goods and technology to Israel, without redaction for commercial confidentiality, as the committee requested in its motion of February 12, 2024. 2. Details on all export or brokering permits for military goods and technology to Israel, whether open or expired, dating back to 2020, not 2006, as the committee requested in its motion of February 12, 2024. 3. Reissue the annex without redactions for commercial confidentiality, as the committee motion specified. 4. That these details be provided within 30 days of adoption of this motion, and that once received, these documents be made public on the committee website. Mr. Chair, I'd like to call for a vote on this motion.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Yes, and we have 2 amendments that we'd like to make to this. I would normally do them separately, but out of respect for the witnesses, I would try to do them quickly, and if it's agreed, we could vote on them together, perhaps. The first is that in the first line, that the motion be amended by deleting the words "the failure of," and then adding "has yet" after Global Affairs Canada and before "to produce," and adding "in full" after "produce" and before the documents. So that would then read that given Global Affairs Canada has yet to produce in full the documents requested by this committee. So it is just acknowledging that we have not done it yet, but there's no desire not to do it. The second amendment is at the end of the motion, and to delete the words "these details." I have it in writing for the clerk as well, and French as well. That we just delete the words "these details" and insert the words "this information be provided on a continuing basis as it becomes available, with the first batch of information to be provided within 30 days." So instead of just saying "these details," to acknowledge that it will come in batches in a continual basis until it's all given to us. And then at the end of the motion, add the words, and that once the documents outlined in sections A through C, meaning all the documents of this motion are received, the committee's motion of February 12th, 2024 be deemed completed. So I would then read the last part of the motion. It would read that this information be provided on a continuing basis as it becomes available, with the first batch of information to be provided within 30 days of adoption of this motion, and that once received, these documents be made public on the committee website, and that once the documents outlined in sections A through C of this motion are received, the committee's motion of February 12th, 2024 be deemed completed.
Thank you. Is everyone clear on the three friendly amendments? Yes. Should we put it to a vote? All those in favor? Yes.
Are we voting on the original motion or on the amendment?
On the amendment.
Okay.
Yes. If it's okay, we'll vote on all three of those amendments. No objections? Okay. Yes, Mr.
Have just quick clarification on the second amendment. I don't want to take much time, actually, that these details so-and-so to be provided, pre-provided within, first of all, it says, as it becomes available with the first batch of information to be provided within 30 days of adoption of this motion. So which one comes first?
Well,
yeah.
Mr. Oliphant?
So what it actually reads, the information that's been requested be provided on a continuing basis as it becomes available, with the first batch to be received within 30 days. So we can't predict exactly, but it will not stop until everything's been received. The first batch will be within 30 days, and it will continue until they're all here.
Thank you. Is that clear? Okay, so all those in favor of the amendment? Show of hands. Mr. Bergeron, yes? Unanimously adopted. So now we go to the actual motion itself. As amended. Show of hands. All those in favor? Again, unanimously adopted. Thank you very much. So we will now go back to the witnesses. Our apologies for that. I'm afraid we have very limited time available. So going forward, each member will only have 2 minutes. So you essentially just get 1 minute in. And I really ask that everyone stick to the time limitations. We start off with MP Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'll go right then to Ms. Hines. The World Food Program has had some success in Namibia in the efforts there. Why? What has been different in Namibia where they have achieved a higher degree of food self-sufficiency?
Thank you. And may I respond, Mr. Chair? Namibia is an upper middle income country, and in that way, definitely in a different level than a lot of other African countries. So if you look at the levels of poverty, if you look at the systems that are there, they are higher. When it comes to food production and self-sustainability, not sure if they're doing so much better. I don't have the figures in my head, but they are very dependent on imports as well. But it's just that it's a more stable. Systems are further developed. Poverty levels are lower. The issue they're dealing with is that there's still gaps between some, especially indigenous groups, actually, and the others. So what you need for that, you need, well, governance is an important part, leadership from the government. I actually, just to give you an example,
I'm sorry, my time is so limited. I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to ask one final question then of Mr. Sultan. Canada actually benefits our agricultural systems from climate change, but obviously the Sahel and parts of Africa do not. But would you agree that the negative effect of climate change is more than compensated with access to crop protection products, to fertilizers, irrigation in those countries for food production and greater resiliency?
I think that the potential for increasing crop yield is probably greater than the negative effect of climate change, even if it's likely that climate change will decrease, in fact, this increase of crop yield, but we have a greater potential to increase crop yield than we could expect the negative impacts of crop yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapp. We next go to Dr. Fry. You have 2 minutes for your question.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, we've been hearing from other witnesses that there are certain trends in Africa where things are getting better and we need to look at economic development and technological development, etc. And yet, 8 of the top 10 countries on the International Rescue Emergency Watch List are in Africa, including Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Now, so why is West Africa having these particular problems, and why are they getting worse and international, and it's becoming more abusive, etc.? What is it that we can do? What is causing this? What are the factors causing it in West Africa? And what can Canada do to deal with this, especially in countries like Mali, because we are bilingual and we can work in these countries in Africa that are francophone? This to Mr. Dion.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think that definitely we do have lots of African countries where things are definitely better, getting better. I'm calling from Senegal, and we just come to complete very successful democratic election and transition. So I can name several as an example, but we know that the 3 Sahelian countries that you name are countries that were already very vulnerable, as I said earlier, in terms of like poverty, economic issue, and then long lasting conflict, if I can say. And what happened is that during this last year with this armed group, the terrorist armed group that's starting, controlling some part of this area, and the response that was not adequate. The reality is that the response that was provided was not adequate, and this gave space to this terrorist group to gain more and more control. And if you add to that, the very high level of poverty, I always say that, the main cause of this crisis is poverty. Because if you take the example of youth, if young people do not have job, do not have education, do not have professional skills, etc., sometimes if there are opportunity to have weapon, they just can join armed group and maybe,
Excuse me, I don't have much time. I just want to ask you one.
In fact, Dr. Fry, you're over already.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Terribly sorry about that. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. 2 minutes, please.
Monsieur Dia.
Mr. Dia, you have 2 minutes to answer my previous question, if you would. Which was, I apologize, yes, about the somber picture that you painted of the state of affairs in Africa vis-a-vis the portrayal of Africa as being a land of opportunity, which the government is touting and using as an incentive to invest massively in Africa. Well, yes, Africa is a continent of opportunity. In Eastern Africa, Kenya, there's a lot of opportunities there, for example. There are other countries such as Sudan that are facing crises, and yet there are opportunities that remain there. I think that Canada has a very special role that it can play to reconnect Africa with the international community. We know full well that we live in a world of interdependency. Unfortunately, some of these countries have a historical relationship with countries that were previous colonizers. And the fact is that it makes it very difficult to have a dialogue and have a partnership on an equal footing. Now, all that these countries are calling for is for partners on an equal footing who is going to treat them as equals and develop a win-win partnership. I think Canada has a very special and specific profile and can play a very productive role to help the rest of the world reconnect with African countries in order to enjoy the economic opportunities that are on offer.
Very much. Mr. Bergeron, we next go to Madam McPherson. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony today. And one of the things that I'm reflecting on is the fact that many of the conflicts that we're seeing in the sub-Saharan African continent in particular are repeat conflicts. We have seen conflict flare up in Sudan, in DRC, repeatedly, time and time again. And I feel like Canada has that important role to play as peacekeepers, and we're not seeing Canada play that role any longer. I'm wondering if I could just ask each of you to talk a little bit about the importance of having countries like Canada engage in peacekeeping in the region because of the repetitive nature of some of these conflicts. Perhaps, Mr. Chair, perhaps you could instruct.
Sure. So why don't we go to Mr. Sultan?
Je vais répondre en français. Je pense qu'en effet.
I'll respond in French. Well, Canada can play an important role in terms of conflicts. These conflicts often cause internal displacement in Africa. There are a lot of displaced persons resulting from that conflict, those conflicts. The second cause is climate change and global warming. And there's a link between global warming and those conflicts, which are caused by dwindling resources. And therefore, a partnership with Canada would prove very useful and helpful to improve security in the region.
Ms. Hines?
Ms. Hines, in 20 seconds, if possible. No?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Oui.
In 20 seconds. Mr. Diao?
Non, moi je pense que en tout cas
Well, Canada's neutral profile means that Canada can be a key actor and help contribute to address the root causes. I think the issue is that to date, well, the problems are being addressed superficially, but not the root causes: poverty, climate change, economic underdevelopment, debt. And until we address those issues, these conflicts can't be addressed.
That concludes our questions. At this point, once again, I wanted to thank you for having accommodated the delay in starting the meeting. I appreciate full well how late it is in the evening, given where you are located. And on behalf of all the members, wanted to thank you for your time and your expertise. So we will now suspend for no more than a minute. Two of the witnesses are here. The next one has done the sound check. But given that we only have limited time till 6:30, we'll try to get started as soon as possible.
Thank you so much.
I'd now like to start with the second panel. We are very, very grateful to have with us here from CUSO International. We have Mr. Nicolas Moyer, who's the Chief Executive Officer. And from Food for the Hungry, we're grateful to have Mr. Jonathan Papolidis with us. Finally, joining us virtually, we have Mr. Abdurrahman Ahmed. So why don't we start off with Mr. Moyer? You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Please do look over every once in a while. If that's up, that means you got to wrap it up within less than 10 seconds. That applies not only to your opening remarks, but also when questions are posed to you by the members. So, Mr. Moyer, thank you. The floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Bonjour. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier le comité.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank the committee for this invitation to appear before you. CUSO International was founded 63 years ago by Canadians who felt deeply that this country had much to contribute to global progress. Our model is based on collaboration. We work closely with local partners around the world, in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, to address the root causes of inequality and improve the economic and social conditions of marginalised groups. We do this by focusing on 3 priorities: strengthening gender equality and social inclusion, creating economic opportunities, and promoting climate change. Also, or rather, although our work extends across these areas of activity, CUSO is often best known for its history of volunteer cooperation. Sharing skills remains an important way for us to have a community impact. Over the years, we've deployed over 14,000 volunteers in over 100 countries, and we're continuing to collaborate with the Global Affairs Canada to implement our collaboration efforts. Today we work in 17 countries, including 6 in Africa, and 48 of our 88 current volunteers are in Africa.
Or hopefully have heard in previous consultations and committee hearings, for a range of strategic reasons, it's clear that Canada would benefit immensely from recommitting to Africa. And yet, despite a period of strong ties in the 70s and 80s, elements of Canada's recent history in Africa paint an opposite picture of disengagement, to the point where, in some places, its presence and relevance has all but disappeared. Diplomatic infrastructure offers one illustration of this, as Canada has only missions in 2/5 of Africa's 54 countries. Another is the disappearance of Canada's most visible brand on the continent, CEDA. The longer this estrangement persists, the more challenging it will be to repair, and even more so in the face of deepening influence by other global actors who have prioritized engagement on the continent. Canada's feminist international assistance policy, the FAAE, commits 50% of aid to be directed to projects in sub-Saharan countries. CUSO is keenly aware of and helping to address the systemic challenges of so many communities in that region. And so we unreservedly applaud this focus on the most marginalized. With the added support provided through the FAAE, the African continent is seeing very positive signs in the fight against gender inequality and discrimination. This progress is especially consequential in the context of Africa's demographic and economic surge. Africa's infant mortality rate has been declining steadily for years now. It's the direct result of increased access to education and health services for women, fewer teen pregnancies, and lower incidences of child marriage, all areas covered by the FAAE. But however impactful these contributions, Canada's undertakings in Africa should not be defined by a charity mindset or an aid policy. Indeed, given its size and future prospects, it may be more appropriate to consider that Canada needs Africa more than Africa needs Canada. Canada must engage on multiple levels and adopt a clear, principled stance. No more talk by Canada about Africa or for Africa's development. To be taken more seriously on the continent for its word to be trusted, for its advice to carry weight, Canada needs to reinvest in partnerships, to show leadership by convening like-minded allies, organizing international summits and conferences, and redefining our relationship with countries on the continent in a way that centers their interests as much as Canada's own. This means shifting whole ways of thinking long embedded in bureaucracy and systems. Our sector calls this decolonization. It's an area where we're all uncovering many lessons about more meaningful and impactful forms of collaboration. Canada can be a leader again, if not by the power of its purse, then with conviction, coherence, and long-term commitment to our partners. It sounds deceptively simple. It isn't. This path requires changing how Canada develops relationships. It means choosing partners carefully and strategically, embedding their interests in our own decision-making, being coherent across multiple policies and practices, and resisting distractions to stay the course over the long term. Relationships with civil society should be a top priority as Canada embarks on this new direction, worthy of equal or greater attention than relations with public or private sectors. It's civil society that delivers change at a systems level, with credibility, accountability, and unparalleled cost effectiveness. As we see time after time, our African partners are driving their own solutions and collaborating amongst themselves with Canadian NGOs, increasingly shifting to a supporting role. Le secteur de la coopération internationale est prêt à contribuer à cet effort.
The international cooperation sector is ready to contribute to this effort as it has done in decades past, so I encourage Canada to tap into the expertise and networks we have cultivated over many years of engagement in Africa. Today's conversation with this committee is an excellent step in that direction, and thank you. I'm honoured and I acknowledge this opportunity to share the viewpoint of our organisation. I'm very much looking forward to your questions in the discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moyer. We now go to Mr. Papalidis. You have 5 minutes as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for the invitation to contribute to this critical study on Canada's approach to Africa. Food for the Hungry, including our FH Canada affiliate, has been working in Africa for 4 decades. We design, develop, and deliver catalytic solutions that build resilience so that children, families, and community can flourish. We do so through community-led development to provide health, water, education, food security solutions, and with gender and environment as cross-cutting themes. Much of the testimony that you've already heard has outlined the significant opportunities on the continent. From the Africa Free Trade Agreement and forecast that 12 of the 20 fastest growing economies in 2024 will be from Africa, to the youth bulge that will contribute to tomorrow's global and regional workforce, and to the natural wealth that can power a just transition to renewable energy. At the same time, you've heard about the converging risks and compounding crises facing the continent. From climate change and worsening disasters to economic shocks and high debt distress, rising instability and conflict, the specter of future pandemics and epidemics, and deepening poverty. The success of Canada's approach to Africa will hinge on our ability to navigate these complex risks and crises in pursuit of advancing African and Canadian interests. As surprising as it may sound, the development community has lacked effective assessments and strategic approaches to determine how to achieve peace and development objectives in the face of overlapping risks, crises, and their root causes. Therefore, as you work to define Canada's approach to Africa, our first recommendation is that the committee affirm the fundamental need for a risk and resilience framework, such as the one used by the OECD, to help establish the scope and substance of interventions necessary to support Africa and advance Canadian interests in the face of adverse conditions. This resilience framework should guide Canadian government action to identify complex risks and crises and their root causes, assess the exposure and vulnerabilities presented by these risks and crises to specific sectors, institutions, markets, groups, and communities that Canada will prioritize as an outcome both of this study and ongoing work by Global Affairs Canada, and find the entry points within these communities, sectors, and markets to strengthen resilience through a Canadian whole-of-government approach. Various studies by the World Bank, Overseas Development Institute, and UN have found that resilience is central to achieving long-term growth, sustainable poverty escapes, and conflict prevention. We've seen positive momentum from Global Affairs Canada to support resilience in several sectors. Canada's feminist foreign policy also presents an opportunity to focus on the resilience of women and girls to a range of shocks and stress. Given the evidence and importance of resilience in this age of crises, at Food for the Hungry, we have recently developed a new evidence-based global program model that is rooted in resilience, and which we are currently piloting in Africa and other regions. Together with our peers in Cooperation Canada's Food Security Policy Group, we have made recommendations for Global Affairs Canada to support gender-responsive and resilient food systems, which Africa desperately needs in the face of worsening droughts, desertification, and other extreme weather events. All this to say that Canadian NGOs are ready to partner with Canada to advance a multi-sector resilience agenda across Africa. These efforts should take place within a broader cooperation approach among like-minded partners for greater leverage and support. To this end, our second recommendation is for the increased use and investment in so-called country platforms across a range of African countries. Country platforms have gone by different names over the past 2 decades, but are among the least visible and under-examined mechanisms in development practice. Emerging evidence from Liberia, Somalia, Niger, and Rwanda have shown the importance and potential of these platforms to do 3 things: convene governments, societal stakeholders, and like-minded international partners on development, promote mutual accountability between actors, and solve collective action problems, including in times of crisis. The OECD, UN, and MDBs have all variously committed to support country platforms. Canada has been the lead donor in support of Mozambique's country platform. In conclusion, we believe that if Canada adopts a more strategic resilience framework to guide its role in Africa, and if it supports greater collective action, dialogue, and mutual accountability between actors, these efforts can exponentially help to support Canada's own understanding of regional developments and opportunities, rally and leverage support from governments and other partners, and help deliver on Canadian national interests in the face of compelling opportunities, but also risks, crises, and uncertainties. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papalides. We now go to Mr. Ahmed. Mr. Ahmed, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Mr. Ahmed, we can't hear you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for inviting me to take part in this study on Canada's approach to Africa. This important reflection takes place just a few days before the celebrations for World Africa Day, originally known as Africa Freedom Day, which is held every year on May 25 in memory of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. Over the last 15 years, I've worked and lived in West, North, and East Africa, and I'm going to, even though I was born in Eastern Africa, I grew up and studied in Canada, and Canada gave me the opportunity to get my first job after my studies to help with the occupied Palestinian territories, and that was sponsored by CEDA. With regard to this important deliberation on Canada's approach to Africa, I'm going to start with a question about the approach being sought. Will Canada's approach to Africa be one of business, mercantilism, and condescension, or an approach based on universal values and principles? It's important to remember that Africa, the cradle of humanity, is an immense continent that today comprises a vast community of nations divided into 54 sovereign states. In terms of population, Africa is the world's second largest continent after Asia, with 1/5 of the world's population, over 70% of whom are young people. Africa is also a continent rich in natural resources, minerals, 30% of the world's mineral reserves, and available agricultural land. Seen in this light, is it Africa that needs Canada, or is it Canada that needs the African continent? Of course, the African continent has its share of difficulties, tragedies, and challenges, but its potential is just as impressive. A dynamic demography that is fostering the rapid growth of a large middle class, an increasingly educated population, abundant natural resources, a more open trading environment, with the recent signing by all African countries of an agreement establishing a free trade area covering the entire continent and significant diplomatic weight in international bodies. So what is Canada's approach to the African continent? Before answering that question, let me remind you of the role that Canada played after the devastation of the Second World War. At a time when the Western world was in the throes of reconstruction and the African continent was engaged in struggles for liberation and independence, Canada could have decided to stay in its corner and opt for isolation. But no, Canada decided to play a leading role in shaping the new world order of the day. This bold policy, described by some analysts as a diplomacy of hope, was geared towards creating and strengthening international institutions capable of producing rules and standards to guide international relations. Thanks to this diplomacy of hope, Canada has been able to build a very distinct identity, becoming a much appreciated mediator between North and South, a promoter of the multilateral system and of peace, notably with the creation of the Blue Berets. This diplomatic activism has been benefited Canada. The country has been elected 6 times as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. In addition, Canada's expertise in disarmament and peacekeeping has been sought after around the world and has enabled it to play an important role in a number of fora. Today, we are living through a period of far greater change than the one that emerged in 1945. The world is in the throes of geopolitical transformation. International relations are changing far too profoundly and tending towards the establishment of a multipolar world. In this new multipolar world, we are witnessing the emergence of a new balance of power between North and South, in which the countries of the African continent are demanding respect for their sovereignty, including in their choice of geopolitical alliances and governance. Whatever happens, one thing is certain: Canada can no longer behave like the good missionary of the last century. It's in this reality that must shape Canada's new approach to the African continent. And the current situation lends itself not to Canada's current indifference or to retreat, but rather to a bold and ambitious commitment to standing out from other economic powers. to make a real difference on the African continent. Canada's approach should be modelled on universalist values by focusing on the following 3 areas. 1. Pragmatic diplomacy and diplomatic activism to promote the reform of international institutions to better shape international relations in a multipolar world. 2. More equitable cooperation and exchanges in which Canada's expertise and technological innovations could make a difference, particularly in the fields of agriculture, education, health, renewable energies, the digital, social and circular economy, etc. 3. Greater openness and transparency on Canada's part to increase multidisciplinary exchanges with African universities and greater collaboration with cultural and sports centres on the African continent in connection with the African diaspora in Canada. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. We now go to questions for the members, and we start off with MP Epp. There's going to be 4 minutes for each member. And for each party. MP Epp, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'll start with Mr. Papalidis. You spoke of, in your first recommendation, about resiliency frameworks. Can you give us a little bit more detail, not too much, only because of lack of time, but also how is that different than what Canada is doing now?
Thank you. So a resilience framework would have 2 components. One is looking at the risks that a particular country or region is facing, how they interact, the crises that are also coming about, and the root causes, the political economy. The second element is looking at 3 specific capacities that need to be cultivated for a resilience approach: an absorptive capacity, an adaptive, and a transformative. Oftentimes, we'll look at risks as an aid community, but we won't look at building these capacities. We'll try and meet people's needs, which is absolutely fundamental. But until we build those absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities, we're not actually building resilience.
So you're basically saying that we need to focus a little bit more on the development side, on the humanitarian side, but it's on the development angles, or that in that where the nexus comes together?
It can truly be a whole-of-government approach where the defense side, the humanitarian side, and the development side are all looking at what kinds of capacities can be strengthened for resilience in their spectrums, and then coming together to address those collectively.
Your second recommendation dealt with, a country platform approach. One of my concerns, and it's been expressed by others around the table, is that Canada will need to focus in its approach to Africa as we look at the intersection of defense, diplomacy, development, trade. We will need to focus on our strengths and the intersection of needs or where we can best help. Will taking a country platform approach help us focus, Canada, as to where we should be putting our efforts?
Short answer, I believe, is yes, because it's a one-stop shop. It's a place where people can come together, governments, societal stakeholders, and partners to decide what are the top priorities, what is everyone doing in that space, and then how can Canada contribute in a way that builds coalitions, helps us punch above our weight, because we're contributing thought leadership, policy leadership, and programming leadership in a place that's far more efficient. This is also the case where Canada might not be in a particular country or might have sort of attachés. When the country platforms meet, the attaché can be present in those meetings and be privy to information that they wouldn't ordinarily get in a more fragmented environment.
So how does that work? There's 54 countries in Africa. There's 27 present missions. So how can you, again, go over, I'm not quite following the intersection of a country platform with kind of our existing framework there.
So the country platform is a place like in Mozambique where you have all the partners that come together with government and they set policy standards, they look at troubleshooting what's happening in a country, where are there resource gaps, where are there bottlenecks, where are there political issues, where are there sector reforms. So Canada, if it chooses to invest more in Mozambique, would invest more in that country platform, which it's already doing, as a way of strengthening the entire response to the country and pinpointing and focusing where Canada can best serve. If you don't have a country platform, it's a very fragmented aid environment, as you probably know. Lots of projects, lots of bilateral communication with ministries. You don't have that collective push for a better future. And what we see in Rwanda, and a mature example, and Somalia as a very emergency, is that these platforms make a huge difference in actually moving the peg forward.
Okay, I'm going to get one question into Mr. Moye. You basically stated in your Senate testimony a month ago or 2 months ago and here that Canada, relatively speaking, and I want to put words in your mouth, that we're not exactly trusted right now on the continent. What do we need to do, as opposed to say, to regain or earn that trust from our African partners?
Okay. Well, in fairness, I don't think I used the word trust. I think Canada remains trusted. I think we're less visible than we were, and I think we have changed our priorities so much over the years that we've lost a lot of the capital that was built in years prior. And I think there's a lot that should be considered about how we can show up in ways that are lasting and leave an impact on those with whom we engage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, go to MP Oliphant. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all the witnesses in both panels. Very helpful. I'm going to focus on Mr. Moyer, or Moy. I would say Moyer in English. Moyer, I thought so. I want to give you a little time to expand on what you said, because everything you said I thought was extremely important about the partnerships and moving our models of engagement towards those situations. In my sense of moving from a dominant model of development towards a commercial development of investment and engagement and employment, there are some things that Canada could do to help establish that framework in a partnership way. I'm just wanting to give you some time to think about the kinds of things Canada is good at doing that we could add capacity in to improve the opportunities for investment, engagement, and employment in Africa, to gradually reduce assistance and increase the ability of Africans and African countries to feed the world, themselves and the world, and do other things.
Well, thank you very much for the question. There is so much to say with respect to that, and I think making choices is difficult. Thank you for pointing out a theme which I think is very important, the one of partnership. And partnership is a deceptively simple concept, and especially when between organizations, people change. And so actually really finding ways to center the decisions we make as a country, as organizations, around the interests of our counterparts and not just our own. And to be long-standing partners means understanding the interests of others. And so part of setting our priorities should be understanding the priorities of our counterparts. And so really understanding what their needs are. And at a policy level, that presents a certain different set of dynamic challenges. When we come to the great aid that we might provide, for example, through the FAAE, how can it be consolidated in a way that represents the kind of interest that government is asking us to prioritize? And there are ways to marry those two considerations, I believe. I do think that investment in a relationship does matter over time. And so I do think we've had an approach of kind of parachuting in. We have to think differently. I talked about volunteer cooperation. Where are exchanges today that might be thinking about things in a different way, about relationships on another playing field? Now, when you talked about kind of a process to move our relationship from an aid relationship to a development, to a trade-based relationship, we have to think strategically about our engagements. And so where does Canada already have ties and added value? How can we strengthen relationships between universities in areas where Canada already has strengths? That's the kind of strategic thinking that could have long-term, real beneficial value, because we could marry the interests of our partners with our own. And I think that's the only avenue by which we get to defining priority